Hi class! Welcome to our videos on models of psychopathology. Really, what causes childhood disorders? And that's what we're going to try to investigate today and take you through a bunch of different models to help us explain and understand these things. So by the end of today, what I really hope you get out of this video is that there are multiple causes to every single disorder. So I want you to understand that we can look at psychological disorders from all different types of perspectives or models, such as the neurobiological model. So how do genes and our brain help us understand what's going on with the child? The cognitive models, so how do our thoughts and our actions influence this? Behavioral models, so we're going to focus a lot on classical and operant conditioning, especially operant conditioning when we get to how we actually do treatments with children, and then understanding more about the family system, so attachment, parenting styles, and the family systems, as well as kind of understanding this all under a Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model. So we'll get into all of these in turn. So the first thing I want you to actually do is to stop this video. I know, really confusing. But what I want you to do is read Valerie's case study. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep referring back to Valerie's case study in order to understand and apply the knowledge that we're going to be talking about to Valerie. All right, so I'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back. So you've now read Valerie's case study. You can keep it open as we start talking about things. You can make your own notes. You can annotate that. Whatever best helps you to understand and start processing and applying this information. So I'm going to ask you to think about what you've already read about. Write some notes down for yourself. What do you remember about these things? And how can we apply that to Valerie's case study? So, answer the following. Which of the 4 Ds does Valerie actually display? So, remember about distress, dysfunction, deviance, and danger. Which of those is she actually showing? And what specific symptoms are making you think that? So, for example, we can think about deviance. So Valerie, from a really early age, is actually engaging in substance use. I think it was in her middle school years that she was actually using substances such as marijuana and alcohol. And that might be deviant. While we expect that maybe from a teenager or a little bit older, or it's more common, that's a pretty young age to start using substances. So that might be something to consider about whether or not she is deviant based on developmental milestones. You might want to also think about things like dysfunction. How's she actually doing in school? Is she actually showing that she is succeeding in school? Doesn't seem like that. So that is dysfunctional because that is something we expect high school students to be able to do. The second question that I want you to ask yourself, and maybe write some notes for yourself, you can of course always pause this video, is how we can use these different types of models to help us understand Valerie's case. So think about what's a neurobiological model. What does that help us understand? What about cognitive? Is she being reinforced or punished by any of these things? What is her attachment like to her parents? What about different types of parenting styles or parenting interactions are there in this case study? Or what's the family system like? So go ahead, write some notes to yourself, just kind of think through this. So let's start with our very first model, the neurobiological models. So as you can see here, we're going to be talking about the brain and different things like genetics. So our first stop in the neurobiological model is to understand a little bit more about our genes. I'm not going to go too far in depth into what genes are. So I hope you remember a little bit about this from your basic bio classes. But basically, our genes are part of our DNA, and that's the basic unit of heredity. So things that get passed on from parent to child. Something that I really need to emphasize here, though, is that genes do not directly influence our behavior. Just because we have a gene that might code for something like schizophrenia or autism, it does not mean that that will automatically lead to a behavior like schizophrenia or autism. So our genes actually are just there to code for different types of proteins. It's there to kind of set up the structure of our brain, for example, and that might lead to differences in our behaviors. But again, it's not that the genes themselves are leading to those behaviors. It's really actually very interesting is that we haven't actually found a schizophrenia gene or an autism gene. Most of the psychological disorders that you're ever going to encounter are going to be influenced by multiple genes. It's not just going to be, hey, here's the one schizophrenia gene that's influencing this. And that is a term that we call polygenetic. So there's more than one. Poly just meaning more than one. So you may be asking yourself, well, why study genetics in psychological disorders if there isn't just one gene that codes for things like schizophrenia? The reason for that is that we know that disorders do run in the family, typically. And so what I have here is some evidence that demonstrates this. So one of the disorders that we think is pretty highly genetic is something like schizophrenia. And what this chart is showing you is the chances that somebody will develop schizophrenia based on their relationship to somebody who has already been diagnosed. So let's say that you are an identical twin and your identical twin actually has developed schizophrenia. What are the chances that you will too? Well, it's about 50%, so that's what this is demonstrating here. And if I am the parent, then I've got about a 5% chance. So, and you can see this is compared to the general population, which is about a 1% chance. The closer you are genetically to somebody with schizophrenia, the higher the chances are that you're going to develop it as well. It's not a 100% chance. Even if I have the exact same genes, there's only a 50% chance. This brings me to a really important model in psychopathology, which is the diathesis stress model. Basically, this says that there is some sort of diathesis or vulnerability, and that could be things like my genes. So my genes bring up some of that vulnerability. But there's also that stress that's there. So things that are happening in the environment that help explain when a disorder actually comes up. So let's pretend like I have a very low stress lifestyle, right? So low exposure over here. If I have high trait vulnerability, so that's this big line right here, I'm still not going to necessarily develop psychopathology. I'm not going to necessarily develop a disorder. There's still a chance but overall it's pretty low. However, if my exposure is pretty high to stressors, so there's a lot going on in my life, maybe I've had abuse in my life, for example, this person who has a high trait vulnerability, so a lot of genetic loading, maybe has a whole lot of vulnerability there, that is going to increase the chances of getting a disorder. The diathesis stress really demonstrates that you need both the underlying vulnerability and some sort of stressors to develop psychopathology. So along with this diathesis stress, I actually want us to watch this video about resilience because I think it really demonstrates how genes and our environment actually interact together to help determine what type of outcomes that children are going to have.
Resilience is the result of a highly interactive process between individual characteristics in the person and the environment in which that individual has developed.
It's really the counterbalancing of difficult things that may exist in the child's life with positive things that occur within the family, but even positive things that may exist in the community.
An easy way of thinking about resilience is like a scale with a fulcrum in the middle of it. And there are things on both sides of that scale, experiences of both bad things or good things.
Our genes shape where the fulcrum is positioned at the start.
There are certain genes that make a child more sensitive to the effects of maltreatment or parental neglect or witnessing violence.
The fulcrum may start out kind of more towards one side or more towards the other side, and that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much these subsequent events affect things positively or negatively.
Science tells us that experience moves the fulcrum, for better or for worse.
Even though we are born with genes, genes will respond differently to certain environmental situations as opposed to others.
What the genes are actually doing are turning up or turning down the expression of chemicals in circuits in the brain and the circuitry in the entire body that govern our responses to stress, to anxiety, to depressive symptoms.
When positive experiences accumulate and children learn coping skills that help them to manage stress, the fulcrum can slide, so the scale tilts toward positive outcomes more easily. That's what resilience is all about.
There's always an adult, or more than one adult, who is key to providing that relationship that helps to build resilience.
At this point in time, I want you to apply this knowledge to Valerie's case study. What is the genetic loading that Valerie has for something like having problems with substance use disorder? Yeah, it sounds like both her parents actually have had difficulties with substances. So either through alcohol or through marijuana use. So these things may lead Valerie to be more susceptible, right? So having a greater vulnerability. But as you can see, there's also a lot of stressors in her life. So this may increase the chance that she actually developed those substance use disorders.